Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all, thanks so much for tuning in. So there's no doubt that the past couple of weeks, your social media feeds have been filled with videos and commentary relating to the Black Lives Matter protests going on in the US. Whether that's videos of the protests on Twitter or blackouts and brand statements on Instagram, it really seems to have displaced the entire COVID-19 situation, at least for a while. But what's interesting, and we're going to talk about in this episode, is how the events going on in the US are being discussed on social media outside of the US. And my guest today is James MacGregor. He's a managing director at Bakamo Public, where they've been using social listening to harvest the organic online conversations by citizens to see how the Black Lives Matter protests have been manifest in online conversations across the UK, Turkey, and Hungary. So you might have already heard of Bakamo from previous episodes of the podcast, where in episode 83, we looked at migration narratives across the EU, and episode 20, where we looked at the news that citizens were sharing in the 2017 French elections. Now, in those episodes, we were diving into fully finished reports on the topics, whereas in this episode, we're going to be looking at the data, really as it's coming out with only a couple weeks lag. And I think there's a couple really interesting points that comes out for me. And one is how the themes of the protests in the US in terms of police brutality or minority oppression is localized to the context of the UK and Turkey, and not so much in Hungary. We'll get into that. But also an interesting point is how the narrative unfolds in relation to real life events going on in those countries. So we'll be looking at two different time points for these three cases. The first is the end of May and the first couple of days of June, and the second time point is a week in the middle of June. So really fresh data, and I think looking at these narratives is a great way to contextualize how these Black Lives Matter protests are impacting the online conversation in other countries other than the US. So without further ado, let me turn it over to James MacGregor. He is a managing director at Bakamo Public. James, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me.
So before we dive into your ongoing work around the Black Lives Matter protests, can you give us a short introduction into your background and why you decided to work with social media listening?
Sure. My first degree was in history. I graduated all the way back in 2000 now. And when I came out of that, I thought I might be a civil servant. So I tried it. It worked out it wasn't for me. Spent some time in DC working as a policy officer. And when I was there, working for an organization called the International Economic Development Council, I really saw how public policy, politics, broadly speaking, evidence and research intersected. And I came back to the UK really wanting to get involved with the evidence part of that triangle. So here in the UK, I got involved with what we call social research. So essentially market research, but for organizations that are values focused rather than focused on their financial bottom line. And before joining Bakamo on the 9th of March, an interesting time to start a new role, I was at Kantar Public in the UK for 4 years, leading on new business and contracting and associated areas. And so I've got quite a wide experience of different kinds of research, and I wanted to take on social listening.
Right. And I know from, looking into your bio a bit that you have experience in qualitative methods, interviews, focus groups. And I wanted to ask, what are some of the pros and cons of those methods versus the type of social media listening you're doing at Bakamo Public?
I wouldn't ever make the case that traditional methods like focus groups or interviews or even quantitative methods of survey and so on are going to go away. They're really important in social science and broadly across a whole range of areas, but they are quite different to what we're doing in social listening, and therefore how you can use them and their benefits and their weaknesses are different as well. So in focus groups and in interviews particularly, you have an awful lot of control over design. You have a control over your sample, if you can find the people, of course. You have control over what questions you ask. You have control over how you moderate, so on and so on and so on. So in essence, you control the shape of the work. And that means that you can bring people into design. So you can bring a client in or a colleague or a partner into all of those questions about sampling and design. So it gives quite a lot of opportunities for organizations who commission research or do research themselves to get involved in the intellectual parts up front to define what it looks like. I think social listening is really different from that. In a sense, there's very little what we would recognize as traditional research design in social listening. What we're in essence doing is scraping the entirety of a conversation off social media writ large. And then we're processing those data using some technology to manage the scale and applying what you'd recognize, Michael, as a traditional rigorous qualitative content analysis. So we're not designing in the same way. We have questions that we're seeking to answer, but we're not asking anybody questions. We're not designing a sample particularly, because the opportunities for sampling and social listening are very limited because of the nature of anonymity on the web and how people use social media. And we're not specifically designing questions that we're asking of people. So we're not going into a setting, whatever it might be, and asking people to respond to our words. We are observing what they say from distance. So it's, in a sense, a very different way of conceptualizing what research is. And you can apply it in different ways. So with focus groups and interviews, you can do a much wider range of work. You can do work looking at, for example, creative content design. So you might have an idea for a campaign and you might use focus groups to test that idea. You might want to explore something that you're considering introducing in terms of public policy and you're not quite sure how that's going to land or what that would do for people. You can't do either of those things in social listening because they don't exist out there in the world. But what you can do is at massive scale, and I mean at the scale of millions of conversations, free from the assumptions that you make in research design, scrape the entirety of a conversation and process that into meaning using, as I mentioned, traditional qualitative techniques. So it's a different way of looking at things, and it's particularly powerful when you apply social listening to topics where you really don't know what the boundaries of those topics are. You don't even know what language is being used in the narratives, where it's highly exploratory, and also where you want to find things out that you cannot imagine potentially existing. So in areas where you don't know enough about it, you can't hypothesize about what findings will be. Social listening lets you look over the horizon of your expectations towards the conversations which are going on that you couldn't really ever have anticipated existing. And we've got lots of examples in our work of that.
Yeah, it's interesting kind of differences in design. I'm thinking, how it differs from academic research. And I think one of the key differences is the speed that you can turn reports out. Obviously, you have to do a rigorous content analysis, but you're not limited to the kind of academic publishing times. And I think that's really important for events like the Black Lives Matter protest that you've been looking at. So why don't we start talking a little bit about that? Can you give us a brief overview of the project and kind of its motivations and its scope?
Yeah, sure. So I think social listening is a very good method for applying to these emerging events which are happening and being discussed at scale. So we really wanted to understand, partly for our own interests as researchers, but also partly because we're an international team and these issues matter to us as much as they matter to anybody else, how the narratives which were emerging around Black Lives Matter in the US were being experienced or being processed, re-narrated in the UK, Turkey, and Hungary. And part of the reason for that was because we have people from the UK, Turkey, and Hungary in our multinational team. We're fundamentally interested in what's going on in those countries, but also we have an understanding of the cultural context within which these conversations take place. So we're able to interpret what this comment or this phrase means within this wider context. So what we did was to harvest all of the conversations that we thought were related to Black Lives Matter in the UK, Turkey, and Hungary in two tranches. And then we compared the difference between the conversations in those countries and at those two different points of time to try and come up with what the narratives are in those nations and observe the evolution in those narratives over time.
Right. And I think, with any type of analysis, it's important to talk about exactly kind of what data you're using. And I know from previous episodes we've done with Bakamo Research is that you're using the Talkwalker platform, which collects these online conversations, social media forums, but it also has some limitations as well, mostly, from the platforms themselves. So could you break down for us where the data is coming from and the type of users you're collecting it from?
Yeah, it's right. The platform does have limitations. I think any way that you harvest data from social media, you're going to come up against the limitations of, as you say, the rules that the platform enforces. And over time, those rules change. So there are some platforms, Facebook very notably, that has over time restricted the degree to which you can harvest data from its platform. But that's less so the case with other big global social networks, and also with a lot of national or local social networks, such as newspaper forums or area-based, topic-based discussion forums. So what Talkwalker lets you do is to essentially harvest all of the data from most of the platforms within the kind of terms of use of those platforms and process them into some shape and some structure. So we're essentially scraping, at best, semi-structured data and then using those traditional, rigorous qualitative approaches to turn it into meaning. What we want to do at the outset when we scrape conversations at this scale is to quickly get down to the discourse which is of value. So what I mean by that is we want to weed out paid placements. We want to weed out people who are influencers. We want to take advertising out of the picture, because what we're interested in hearing is real people's genuine voices. So we apply, often using some software, or more often actually using human judgment of people who speak that language and are from that country, to do that filtering for us. So we end up with just a bunch of real people talking about the issue in their own words.
Right. And just to put a little context to that, I guess at least for Twitter, that's people with less than 3,000 followers, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's an arbitrary judgment, and that's a guide rather than a hard rule. But we're in essence saying anybody that's got 3,000 followers or more is an influencer. Anyone that has fewer than that is a real person, in air quotes. So we're trying to make this distinguish between people who are having discourse and people who are pursuing an agenda.
Man, I'm well off the influencer mark, so I gotta get up there.
No, me too.
Climb up the chain. So let's dig into the findings, which I'm sure the listeners are very curious about. And you sent me some of the narratives that you've identified. I'm going to try to kind of structure them a bit into the questions. And when I was looking at the narratives that you found, basically the first thing that it kind of jumped out at me was, especially for the Turkish and British cases, the users were drawing nationally specific parallels with the U.S. about minorities. So in the Turkish case, one example was comparing blacks in the U.S. to the Kurdish minority in Turkey. In the British case, we kind of saw a similar parallel with British Muslims. So can you discuss some of those narratives and how they were kind of similar or different across countries?
Yeah, I found the same thing really interesting. And exactly as you say, what happened very quickly in Turkey and in the UK is that people in those countries are observing the events in the US, and they're immediately drawing precise parallels with situations, usually ongoing, long-running situations in their own countries. So in Turkey, as you said, blacks in America are identified with the Kurds, and even particular political campaigns or movements like the Gezi Park protests, for example. So something that isn't particularly about ethnicity, but which is, I suppose we could say, at least from the points of view of the people involved in those protests, a kind of struggle for liberation or justice, as they would see it. So that immediate translation of US events into a Turkish context was really apparent, happened at scale, and happened essentially immediately. And we see a similar phenomenon in the UK, but the issues in the UK, of course, are different. So that identification in the UK was more so directly with Black British people. And as you mentioned, British Muslims particularly. And the narrative, I think, probably more closely raises the US narrative around how the UK needs change along the same lines as the change that's being sought by activists in the US. So I think we'd probably fair to say that the UK is the most similar. The narratives in the UK are the most similar with the US. But even when we look at Turkey, it's immediately translated into the local context.
Which is kind of interesting because, again, you're looking at these, quote unquote, non-influencers. So you're not having necessarily organizations that are driving these comparisons. Like I think there was a narrative about Muslim Lives Matter in the UK, but it doesn't seem like it was sort of, really organized by online Twitter accounts or local journalists.
No, I don't think we are seeing that. I mean, of course, there's a whole range of different influences, and identifying exactly what the source of any given emerging narrative is possible, but generally speaking, the answers to those things are complex. So we don't, generally speaking, see in narratives happening at this scale, one set of people creating it and then it's spreading to others, spreading widely across the piece. There's more going on than that. But even where these comparisons are being immediately drawn by just, normal people like you and me who are online talking about this stuff because we want to express a view, the rational links might not be immediately obvious, but emotionally it's clearly highly resonant to people, and everyone can understand and get on board from the get-go, and very often can generate an opinion in a matter of minutes.
Right. And one thing that was interesting is that when we look at Hungary, there really isn't such a minority comparison with blacks in the U.S., despite the prominent Roma minority in the country. So why do you think that is?
It is an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? We were talking about it in the team the other day, because as I mentioned, we've got several Hungarians in the team, and we were trying to understand exactly this phenomenon. So while there are kind of parallels that you can draw, it's probably fair to say that Hungary ethnically is a less diverse place than the US and the UK and Turkey. And where there are minority populations that have struggles for justice, as they and activists would see them, a lot of the narrative doesn't happen online. So there's a lot less kind of public discourse about justice for Roma in Hungary than there would be public discourse about the issues that we've talked about in Turkey, the UK, and the USA. And so it really doesn't hardly come up at all. The conversation in Hungary is almost exclusively about the events in the US and the law and order implications for the US.
Right. And I want to kind of return to that, where the U.S. fits in a bit later on. But another theme that was definitely present is, of course, law enforcement, which is kind of the other side of that coin, and obviously a key actor in this wave of protests. So how are the police discussed across the different countries?
In lots of different ways. So there's a kind of, we'll come on to talking about this, I'm sure, but there's a real evolution in narrative in the UK and Turkey in particular, less so in Hungary for, I think, the reasons that we talked about. But in the UK, for example, in the early days of this debate, there was quite a lot about how the police in the UK, to some degree, acted similarly to the police in the US. And immediately alongside that narrative was a similar counter-narrative, which was about how the police in the UK behave almost nothing like the police in the US, and that actually events in the US, therefore, don't really have much to do with events in the UK at all. So this debate around the UK police force, its history, its conduct, the rule framework that it behaves within, is immediately and very vigorously contested by lots of different people. Also in the UK, I should say that there's a widespread recognition of loads of people involved in that narrative that the police in the UK aren't as bad, in quotes, as the police in the US. So there's a broad agreement on that, despite there not really being a broad agreement on the degree to which the police are going to need to change how they behave. In Turkey, there's a degree of similarity in the debate. Again, this idea that the Turkish police, for any or all of their failings, are somehow better than the police in the US is quite a prominent narrative. But on the flip side, there are an awful lot of examples coming from people who would see themselves as supporters of liberation for whatever group it might be, saying that actually, no, the police behave themselves pretty much as badly here as they do in the US. So a very wide range of views, quite a vigorous debate about police conduct, and a big part of the conversations in the UK and Turkey.
Yeah, and that gets to the point, I think, of, and you kind of hit on it, how the U.S. is discussed across countries. Because it's pretty stark that in Hungary, it seems that most of the online conversation is just commenting on what's happening in the U.S., whether that's, looting or the implications for the U.S. election. Whereas in the UK and Turkey, it seemed that the themes of the protests, whether it's police brutality or sort of minority oppression, that they were kind of localized to those contexts. So like some of the themes you highlight were that in the UK, people were talking about how racism also exists in British small towns, or in Turkey, looking at how Antifa could be kind of paralleled to paramilitary groups in Turkey. So my question is, by looking at these conversations, were there more commentaries about the events going on in the US, or were they generally localized to specific contexts, and were those kind of localizations similar or different?
I think it's much more, the conversation is much more immediately localized to specific contexts. It doesn't mean that there isn't conversation about events in the US, but where those narratives become embedded in existing national conversations, there's an intertwining of existing debates with US events, which kind of produces in itself a new narrative and a new discussion. So they're specifically national. Although those national debates have been provoked by events in the US, they very quickly attain their own character. And in the UK, if you compare the narrative in the UK and narrative in Turkey, or the narratives rather, how they evolve over time and how they change and who gets involved is really, really different in the UK and Turkey. So events in the UK were a lot to do with things that happened on the ground as a result of a reaction to Black Lives Matter. So there were a lot of protests here in the UK. I'm based in London, so saw a bit of it. There was a lot of debate about statues and about the British Empire and the UK's colonial past. And from that, new conversations emerged. Whereas in Turkey, it was related much more to stuff that was going on there. This idea that this is the US Spring as payback for the Arab Spring became quite a prominent conversation in Turkey at some point, and all relating back to actions of their own police force and their own governments and their own liberation struggles as they would see them. So it very quickly attained a national character.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to think of the kind of counterexample where, let's say you have, let's say the Arab Spring or anti-Putin protests in Russia. Americans don't really localize that so well into, their history of protests. Like, you don't draw parallels between the Arab Spring and civil rights movement, for example. So it's interesting that the U.S. kind of, because this phenomenon is happening there, and it's obviously a big event, but it's really, I guess, putting these issues on the online conversations in other countries outside of the U.S.
It seems exactly that way to me as well. And what it really underlines to me how central US culture and US politics remains to the world's conception of big ideas of liberty and democracy and popular representation and so on. So I would, of course, there's a lot going on in here, but why, for example, the US populace aren't talking about, the Kronstadt rebellion or whatever it might be, or whatever's going on in Russia right now as part of their discourse, is because they just don't occupy the central positions in people's thinking about the fundamentals of how their country should work, or what the nature of government is, what liberty means, and all those sorts of big questions. So it just underlines to me that the US remains in a position of extremely globally influential culture.
Right. It's all about how many hands does Trump use when he's drinking his water.
Well, absolutely. Everybody knows. Everybody knows that yesterday or the day before, Trump threw away a glass after drinking it with one hand. I mean, this is as much part of a global understanding as it is a part of America's national political discourse.
So you also hit on this a bit, was looking at the two different time waves that you looked at. And I think this is really interesting that the first time wave, which was sort of end of May and getting into the beginning of June, and then the second time wave was more in the middle of June, that during the first wave, there was more of a left-leaning narrative. And then in the second wave, just a couple weeks later, there was more of a kind of right-wing counterpoint. So can you kind of discuss that dynamic and whether it was consistent across all the different cases?
We certainly saw exactly that phenomenon in the UK and Turkey. Less so in Hungary, because the narratives in Hungary were more about people commenting on and observing what was going on in the US. So I suppose that stands to a reason. There's less room for evolution in the narrative when really the narrative is coming from somewhere else. But in the UK and Turkey, as you said at the beginning, in the early days, a lot of the online discourse was from the liberal side of it, from the sort of centre and left side of the conversation. So there's a lot of talk about, in both the Turkey and the UK in particular, actually, about how this was part of a global change. Maybe this was the beginning of something big, something which would resonate around the world. There was a lot of talk about the idea of black oppression in the UK and in Turkey, and Kurdish oppression in Turkey being the proxy experience, and other related kind of left-wing liberal movements. Over time, and I think particularly in the UK, there was this move towards more conservative voices, talking about the idea that actually what's going on in the US has nothing to do with what's going on in the UK. And lots of conversations I touched on before about the national emblems which became intertwined with the narratives in the UK. So things about statues, monuments, things about war memorials. There was conversation in the UK about introducing new specific penalties for the criminal damage of war memorials, for example, and lots of focus on street protest, its relationship with the pandemic. So should people be out on the streets at this time when we're all should be social distancing? And then violence, because there was some evidence of violence during the Black Lives Matter protest and then in some counter demonstrations, which happened some point afterwards. So over time, those more liberal left voices, I wouldn't say they were necessarily diluted, but they were certainly joined by people who didn't share the view that this was a particularly relevant set of events for the UK and wanted to express their unhappiness about how people in the UK were using US events to kind of express their unhappiness in unlawful or unethical ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's two different points in time, but they're just, a week or so apart. So it's interesting that you have that kind of lag. It takes some time for the counter voices to emerge in the conversation.
Yeah, it does. I mean, they're always there. There's a debate going on all of the time. But in terms of the scale, it seems that it's kind of in reaction to specific events. So there was a statue, I'm sure you know, toppled in Bristol and thrown into the river. Around that event, there's a real spike in people with more conservative points of view contributing to the conversation and saying, we don't like this.
Right.
There were street protests and a monument, a war memorial in central London called the Cenotaph was vandalised, or it's somebody spray painted on Churchill's statue, which is also outside Parliament in central London. So a lot of people were then moved to comment that they thought that was unacceptable, and that wasn't the kind of response that they would want to see from a Black Lives Matter movement. Some of those people were saying they had a lot of sympathy with it, but they didn't kind of approve of the tactics. So a lot of that injection of a more skeptical point of view was in response to events which people thought were not right.
Gotcha. Because I think in the beginning, people were more or less down for the cause. It seemed like there was really high solidarity, especially after this video with George Floyd and Derek Chauvin, and then maybe when there's a sense that it crossed the line, that's when you see this spike in the counter narrative.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it's a good marker of it becoming a very UK focused conversation. So there's a lot about the UK's imperial past, and particularly in kind of early June, there was a lot of talk, not least by the Prime Minister actually, about Churchill as a figure, Churchill's political views, statues, and taking down statues in public places. So it very quickly became a domestic debate about how we respond to things which there's a degree of broad acceptance that exist in our culture.
Mm. And do you think that explains, it was interesting looking at the two different time waves. In the Turkish case, there's a dramatic drop from, I think, 150,000 or so data points in the first week or the first wave down to 12,000. Whereas in the British case, you see this basically doubling from 68,000 data points to over 100,000. So do you have any ideas about, I guess we just talked about maybe why the British case spiked, but why did the Turkish case drop so much? Do you think there's just been a lack of events going on there that would cause these spikes?
I think in summary, that is my view. And I suspect, and this is really my speculation, that it's rooted in fewer opportunities for public demonstrations of dissatisfaction with the status quo in Turkey in comparison to the UK. So a lot of what the reaction was in the UK was about people exercising their right to protest and everything that went along with that. In Turkey, there's probably less scope for that kind of thing, just because of the nature of the country. And so perpetuating the conversation through a whole bunch of events of things going on is less prominent. I mean, having said that, there were particular Turkish debates which plugged into ongoing debates which were kind of boosted by the events in the US. And one obvious one that came out quite strongly was this hashtag that emerged called Turkish Students' Lives Matter. Now, that's about essentially the government's requiring final year high school students to take the university entrance exam during this summer, whereas there's a lot of concern about whether that's the safe thing to do during the pandemic. So around that conversation, there was quite a lot of attention. But because I speculate, but because in Turkey there just wasn't as much sort of public demonstration, that there just wasn't as much to talk about. So my last question has to do with the prominence of these narratives, and it relates a bit to the methodological approach and sort of what you've been looking at, which is you identify several narratives across these conversations, but they aren't necessarily ranked in terms of how often they appear or kind of what proportion they are of the overall conversation. And so I wanted to ask, do you think these narratives carry equal weight, or how do you see the trade-off between quantifying and ranking these narratives versus presenting a survey of the broad conversation online? I think it's a really interesting question. I think, of course, no, not all conversations are equal in terms of weight or merit or any other metric that we could probably come up with. the reason that we, generally speaking, don't look to quantify these kinds of narratives for several reasons. One is because with this phenomenon that we're exploring, this US BLM events experienced in other countries, we're in the middle of something. So if we start quantifying different aspects of the conversation, we're at risk of really quantifying the time boundaries that we put around the conversation as much as we're quantifying anything within the conversation, if I'm making sense. Because it really depends when we take the slice and what bits of the slice we count. And if we were to do the same thing a couple of weeks later, then it would probably have a very different result. And I'm not sure how much that would necessarily tell us. Where we do quantify is when we're able to step back from the entirety of the conversation, where we can say it's happened, as it were, that those narratives have come to some kind of conclusion or to some kind of end point. Then we can do more with quantification because it's probably more meaningful. So I'm a bit skeptical about quantification kind of in midstream. But also here, I think if we want to understand what weight different narratives have, we probably want to apply different measurements than measurements of frequency. Frequency is part of it, but I think we also want to understand salience. We want to understand how viral a message is. We want to understand how impactful that message is, how much it's traveled, who's shared it, who's consumed it, who's reshared it, and so on. So I think in quantifying with the intention of getting an understanding of weight and meaning of narratives to different groups, we really want to try and map out not just the frequencies, but the networks of travel of different narratives among different people. So that's more so where I'd focus on quantification.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's interesting. We all kind of know more or less what the main narratives are in the U.S. right now. So it's interesting to hear about, what's going on in different countries more on the European side. So James, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your research with us.
No, thank you, Michael. Thanks for the time. I appreciate it.
I've just been speaking with James MacGregor, Managing Director at Bakamo Public. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Keep an eye on those podcast feeds. I'll be recording a couple interviews this week and hoping to put those out a little bit sooner rather than later. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmö. See you next time.